The night never left him. Elias Monroe still wakes to the echo of artillery and the faint cries of children carried through smoke-filled air. Decades have passed since the jungles of Vietnam swallowed his youth, yet one image refuses to fade. A barefoot girl standing at the edge of a burned-out village, her eyes wide with fear and resignation. That memory, more than the sound of gunfire or the weight of a rifle, has followed him into every chapter of his life. Elias was not meant to be a soldier. He had been a college student buried in books and ideas when the draft pulled him into a war he did not choose. By the summer of 1969, he found himself in the Central Highlands, surrounded by barbed wire, heavy artillery, and an enemy he was told to hate, but had never truly seen. Nights were endless, each hour stretched taut by the fear of mortars falling from the dark sky. Yet the most haunting moments did not come from combat, but from the quiet encounters, stepping into a village, laying aside his helmet, and realizing the supposed enemy were women, elders, and children struggling to survive. The question has never left him. What does a man do with the knowledge that he was once a tool of destruction in a land of innocence? For Elias, that question turned into a lifelong struggle with guilt, anger, and the search for redemption. He became a poet, an educator, and eventually a voice for peace, trying to transform his scars into testimony. But beneath the words lies a deeper wound, the moral injury of knowing he cannot undo what was done. Tonight, his story unfolds. And the question remains, can a man ever return to the place that broke him and find a way to heal? The memory never loosens its grip. It presses against me each night, when the silence of my house is broken by echoes that are not really there. The thud of mortars in the distance, the metallic rattle of shell casings, rolling across packed dirt, the voices of boys who were barely men calling out in fear. I thought time would quiet those sounds, but it hasn't. Instead, the years have sharpened them. I can still see the girl on the edge of that village barefoot, her eyes far older than her age, staring at me as if she knew what I had become before I even realized it myself. That moment stayed with me, and it is where my story must begin, though it truly began much earlier when a letter summoned me away from the world I thought I knew. I was in graduate school, lost in economics and books, when the draft board reached out and erased the life I had been preparing for. There was no time to protest, no time to ask questions. Within weeks, I was stripped of everything familiar. 8 weeks of basic training, 8 weeks of advanced artillery instruction. That was all it took for them to take students, mechanics, clerks, and turn us into soldiers. We wore uniforms that didn't quite fit, carried rifles we barely understood, and followed orders barked by men who seemed more machine than human. I was 21 years old, unprepared, unwilling, yet propelled forward by a system that demanded bodies. The trip across the ocean to Vietnam is seared into me. The plane was crowded but unbearably quiet, each of us staring ahead, pretending we weren't terrified. I clutched a book in my hands, Sartre's writings on genocide, hoping words could shield me from the abyss I was about to fall into. They didn't. When the plane door opened in the suffocating heat of Tan Son Nhut Air Base, the world shifted. I stepped onto foreign soil and felt utterly alone. Unlike later wars where units traveled together, I arrived with no one. I knew no brother in arms to lean on. I was just one more body shuffled into a helicopter, flown across a patchwork of green, and dropped into the Central Highlands, where death had already claimed more names than I could comprehend. The days blurred into nights, and it was the nights that carved themselves deepest into me. Darkness was never a friend there. It was a warning. Each night, we sat in bunkers or behind the barrels of artillery pieces waiting. Mortars would whistle down without warning, shaking the earth and reminding us how fragile we were. Sometimes it was sappers slipping through the wire shadows, intent on tearing apart everything we clung to for safety. I lost count of the number of nights my heart thrashed inside my chest, convinced I wouldn't see the sunrise. You learn to fear not the sound of explosions, but the silence just before the breathless pause that tells you something is coming. We told ourselves we were there to fight an enemy, to keep them at bay. But what unsettled me most was how little I saw of this supposed enemy. My job as an artilleryman meant distance. I pulled lanyards that sent shells screaming miles away, never seeing what they destroyed, never knowing who they killed. Sometimes the fire missions made sense supporting the infantry under attack, but more often it was random harassment and interdiction shells hurled into the dark just to keep someone awake on the other side. I knew deep down those rounds didn't land on soldiers alone. They fell on huts, on fields, on children. I began to feel like a ghost haunting people I had never met, leaving destruction I couldn't see, but could imagine all too vividly. And then came the day that cut through the fog of orders and duty. A few of us, weary and restless, slipped away from the fire base and walked toward a nearby village. It was against the rules, of course. We stacked our helmets, flak jackets, and rifles in a pile, leaving one man to watch them, and we stepped into that village unarmed. I remember the eyes that met a suspicion first, then disbelief, then something softer. Women with lined faces, old men stooped with age, children clutching one another's hands. No soldiers, no enemies. Just human beings who had endured too much already. One girl in particular remains with me. She couldn't have been more than 11. She sold us herbs, cigarettes, whatever she could, her small hands carrying the burden of survival that should never belong to a child. She smiled shyly, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion far beyond her years. At the time, I didn't fully grasp what had been stolen from her. Later, when I had children of my own, the weight of it crashed down on me. The realization that we had ripped away her childhood, forcing her into a role no child should ever play. I see her face even now, hovering between innocence and despair. A reminder that war always crushes the smallest shoulders first. That day in the village shook me. It shattered the lie I had been told that we were there to fight an enemy, that every round fired was necessary, that destruction was justified. Standing there without a weapon, I realized how hollow that story was. The so-called enemy were children selling scraps, women tending fires, old men staring at us with weary eyes. They were not abstractions. They were not targets. They were people. And in that recognition, something inside me broke. From that moment on, I carried a different kind of fear. Not just the fear of dying under mortar fire or being ambushed in the night, but the fear of what I was becoming. Every day in uniform seemed to carve away at my humanity, replacing it with obedience, detachment, and silence. Yet those few hours in the village reminded me of what still remained, the stubborn belief that even amid war we could choose to see one another as human. Looking back now, I understand. That was the first crack in the armor the military tried to wrap around me. It was the beginning of my refusal to accept their version of reality. But at the time, it simply felt like confusion, a gnawing contradiction I couldn't resolve. I was a soldier in a war I didn't believe in, commanded to pull triggers I didn't want to touch, haunted by the faces of children who should have been laughing, not bargaining for scraps of survival. That contradiction became the rhythm of my nights, echoing louder than the mortars, more suffocating than the darkness itself. And so when I tell you the war never left me, it isn't just the battles or the barrages that follow me. It is that village, that girl, that realization that we were not liberators, not protectors, but intruders in lives that deserved peace. That was the day I began to understand that the deepest wounds of war are not only carved into the land or the bodies that fall, but into the hearts of those who survive, carrying memories they cannot escape. And I, Elias Monroe, have carried them ever since. It always begins with the nights. That is when memory cuts deepest, when the silence around me now collides with the silence, then the one that pressed down on us in Vietnam just before the mortars came. I can still taste the fear in the air, metallic like blood, mixed with the smoke of spent shells. I was barely more than a boy when I stepped into that place, a graduate student ripped out of classrooms and books, tossed into a uniform that felt more like a shroud than a shield. The government told me I was a soldier, but inside, I was still clinging to a life that had nothing to do with killing. And yet there I was in the Central Highlands alone, thrown into a war I never believed in, waiting each night for death to choose whether or not to come. They rushed us through the motions of training 8 weeks of learning how to salute, march, obey, followed by 8 weeks of artillery instruction. As if a few months were enough to make us warriors enough to erase everything we once were. Then came the flight, long and suffocating, across the ocean, to a country none of us had ever seen but would never forget. When the plane door opened, the air itself was an enemy-thick wet, clinging to our skin as though it wanted to remind us that we would not leave easily. I remember stepping off with my rifle slung across me, surrounded by men who looked just as hollowed out by dread as I was. We were young, but fear had already aged us. Alone, that is what I felt most keenly when they dropped me into that world. Unlike some who arrived with units, I came without comrades, a single body shuffled into place at a firebase among strangers. No one knew my name. No one cared. I was another number in a machine that needed flesh to keep running. That loneliness was its own kind of terror. At night, as I lay in the dirt, listening to the jungle breathe, I knew that if I vanished, there would be no one who would notice. Beyond the line on a report, the nights never grew easier. Each one was a trial. Mortars screamed out of the darkness, shaking the ground, rattling my bones, and reminding me how small I was. Sometimes we heard the whispers of sappers moving through the wire shadows, bent on cutting through our fragile illusion of safety. Sleep was shallow, broken by sudden bursts of gunfire, by the pounding of my own heart when silence lingered too long. Because it was the silence that was most dangerous, the still air, just before an explosion, the breathless pause that meant something was coming. I learned to dread calm as much as chaos. We fired back, of course. Artillery was our language. The coordinates would come through the radio, and we would send thunder miles away into the night. But I never saw who it struck. The destruction was invisible to me, hidden by distance. At first, that seemed easier, safer, but soon it became more terrifying. Firing blindly into the dark, into villages I would never walk through, meant that the blood was real but faceless. I told myself I was only following orders, that this was war, but deep inside I felt the lie. Those shells were not landing on soldiers alone. They were falling into homes, onto children, into fields, where families tried to cling to scraps of normal life. And though I never saw the bodies, I could feel them. I still feel them. What cut deepest, though, was not the violence itself, but the realization of who bore its weight. One day, restless and defiant, a few of us slipped out of the firebase and walked toward a nearby village. We left behind our weapons stacked in a neat pile, as if shedding our skins. For the first time, I stepped into that place unarmed. The villagers stared first in fear, then disbelief. They saw us not as faceless soldiers, but as boys, bareheaded, uncertain. Women with weathered faces, old men bent with years' children, clutching one another. This was the enemy we were told to fight. There was a girl there, maybe 11. Her small hands carrying the weight of survival. She sold what she could, cigarettes, herbs, anything that might feed her family for a day. At the time, I thought little of it. Later, when I had children of my own, the truth of it crushed me. She should have been in a classroom chasing laughter, not bargaining with soldiers who had brought war to her doorstep. I see her face still, half smile, half resignation, the innocence of her age already stolen. That moment changed me. Standing there in that village, stripped of weapons, I could no longer pretend. The war was not about enemies and victories. It was about people, fragile, exhausted, enduring more than any human should. They were not soldiers, not threats, not symbols. They were simply human, and we were tearing their lives apart. From then on, every night of fear carried a second weight. Not only the fear of dying, but the fear of becoming something I could not live with. The military wanted to mold us into machines, to obey without question, to fire without thought. But I had seen too much, felt too much. I could not silence the contradiction clawing at me. Each mortar we fired echoed inside me long after it exploded somewhere unseen. Each quiet moment with the villagers reminded me of what little humanity I had left to cling to. The war tried to turn me into a tool, but that village planted something else. A doubt. A wound, a truth I could never shake. I began to understand that the real enemy was not across the wire, but inside us, in the orders we followed, in the blindness we accepted, in the humanity we allowed to slip away. And though I left that place decades ago, it never left me. Those nights, that silence, that girl's eyes, they are still here, pressing against me in the dark, reminding me that survival is not the same as living, and that some wounds never close. That was the first time I truly understood what war does. Not just to bodies, not just to land, but to the soul of those who fight it. It fractures you, leaves you chasing pieces of yourself that you may never find again. I have been chasing them ever since. I never thought of myself as a soldier. Even now when people ask, I stumble over the word. I was drafted, pulled out of books and lectures, stripped of a future I thought I understood, and handed a rifle and a uniform that felt like borrowed skin. By the time I landed in Vietnam, I was already hollow with fear, carrying questions I couldn't answer, and a weight I didn't yet recognize. They threw me into the Central Highlands, surrounded by strangers, who were just as terrified, though most of us pretended otherwise. We learned quickly that pretending was its own form of survival. Every day carried the same rhythm heat that pressed into our bones. Hours spent maintaining weapons, nights spent praying for the Sunday. The air reeked of gun, oil, and sweat, but it was the nights that broke us. Mortars would fall out of nowhere, splitting the silence wide open, scattering dirt across our bunkers. Sometimes sappers slipped through the wire shadows, bent on reminding us that safety was an illusion. Sleep was a luxury, and when it came it was shallow, haunted by dreams of fire and screams. Each morning we woke not rested but shocked to be alive. I remember writing in my journal on the flight over, clinging to words as if they could steady me. I told myself I would hold on to my humanity, that I would not let this war turn me into something unrecognizable. But words are fragile in the face of artillery. Every round we fired seemed to strip away a piece of me. We sent shells miles into the jungle, into villages I would never see, and each time I wondered what or who was caught in their path. The officers called it strategy, harassment, and interdiction, keeping the enemy awake. I called it something else. I called it destruction without thought, violence without purpose. And then there was the village. That day is burned into me as clearly as the scars on my hands. A few of us walked out against orders, leaving our helmets and rifles behind. We wanted, if only for a moment, to step outside the wire and see something other than death. The villagers stared when we entered, unarmed, uncertain. There were no soldiers there, no enemies, only women bent over small fires. Old men with eyes too tired to hide their sorrow. And children watching us with the quiet stillness of the broken. One girl caught my eye. She couldn't have been more than 11, selling what she could, cigarettes, herbs, anything that might feed her family. At the time, I treated it like an oddity, something to note and forget. But years later, when I held my own children, I understood what had been taken from her. Childhood, laughter, safety, all of it stripped away, replaced by survival. I cannot think of her without my throat tightening. I cannot forgive myself for being part of the machine that forced her into that role. That village shattered something inside me. It destroyed the story I had been told that we were there to protect, that every round fired was necessary. Standing in front of those people unarmed, I realized that the enemy I had been taught to fear were not faceless figures in the jungle. They were human beings, fragile and exhausted, living under the shadow of our guns. The war was not about freedom or victory. It was about survival, theirs and ours, twisted together in a nightmare none of us chose. From that moment on, every action I took felt heavier. Each night when the mortars came, I thought not only of my own fear, but of theirs, of how the children must have flinched at the same sounds, how their sleep must have been torn apart just like mine. Each shell we fired carried more than explosive weight. It carried the knowledge that innocence was being crushed somewhere in the dark. I could not look at myself the same way again. The uniform no longer felt like protection, but like a mask hiding who I truly was. The war wanted to make us tools, obedient and silent, but I had seen too much. The eyes of that girl, the weary nods of the old men, the quiet resilience of the women, they were carved into me deeper than any order could reach. And so, even as I stood among soldiers, I felt apart from them. I was no longer fighting for victory, no longer believing in the words printed on the cards they gave us about winning hearts and minds. I was simply enduring, counting the nights, clinging to fragments of humanity in a place determined to erase them. The war had begun to rewrite me, but in that village, I glimpsed the truth. And it is that truth, as painful as it was, that has followed me ever since. I can still feel the weight of that uniform, the way it clung to me like a second skin I never chose. They told us we were soldiers, protectors, agents of freedom. But most of the time, I felt like nothing more than a body being moved from one place to another, a pawn dressed in olive drab. In the early days, I clung to the illusion that perhaps there was honor in it, that maybe survival itself would make sense of the chaos. But war strips illusions faster than it strips flesh, and it was not long before I understood that what I had been forced into was not about honor at all. It was about destruction. And the destruction seeped into everything, into the villages we fired upon, into the silence of the nights, and into my own chest where no bullet had to land to leave a wound that would not heal. The days blurred together in a haze of drills and waiting. At the firebase, I became one of the countless men tethered to machines of artillery trained to send thunder into the jungle without ever seeing what it struck. The coordinates would come down numbers barked over radios, and then we pulled lanyards that released fury into the dark. The shells screamed across the night sky, and a few moments later, the horizon lit with distant fire. We told ourselves it was necessary, that we were protecting our comrades. But too often it was not protection, it was harassment. Fire random rounds, launched simply to keep the other side awake, to remind them of our reach. Imagine firing destruction into the night, without even knowing what or who might be waiting on the other end. I did that. My hands did that. And though I never saw the bodies, my imagination filled in the silence. Children, mothers, old men, their shadows have followed me ever since. At first I tried to bury the doubt. Soldiers are taught to obey, to trust that someone above them knows the reasons. But the cracks widened each time I heard the stories from infantrymen who returned to base, their eyes emptied of light. They spoke of villages burned of bodies, left broken, of the thin line between survival and cruelty that was crossed more times than anyone cared to admit. They were boys, most of them the same as me, but war had twisted them into something unrecognizable. I watched decent men become numb, and numbness became its own kind of violence. I feared not only what was being done to the Vietnamese people, but what was being done to us, what we were becoming. One night after a barrage, I walked outside the wire and looked at the jungle still smoldering in the distance. There was no enemy in sight, only the faint glow of burning trees and the acrid stench of smoke. I stood there and thought somewhere in that fire there were homes, maybe a family gathered in fear, maybe a child clutching her mother. The army would call it victory. I could only call it devastation. That moment carved itself into me like shrapnel. It was the first time I admitted to myself, even in silence, that I was not proud of what I was part of. I was ashamed. And then came the confrontation with command. A major arrived one day eager to stamp his authority and declared that no one was to speak to the villagers who approached the wire. They came to sell small things, fruit, cigarettes, even just conversation. But he saw only risk, only corruption. I saw people trying to hold on to a shred of life amid the wreckage. When he barked the order, something in me snapped. I walked to the wire anyway, defiant, and spoke to them. His fury was immediate. He threatened me with an Article 15, a reduction in rank, humiliation in front of my peers. But for once, I did not care. I wrote my defense argued that they had told us to win hearts and minds, yet forbade us from even acknowledging those hearts and minds as real. Somehow, I won. But victory was bitter, because what it revealed was not fairness, but the depth of absurdity. The army wanted us to be machines of obedience, even when their own slogans contradicted their orders. That was the moment the war turned inside me. I no longer believed their justifications, no longer trusted their strategies. I began to see the war not as a mission, but as an atrocity, unraveling day by day. And what haunted me most was not the firefights or the mortars, but the children. Children who should have been running barefoot in play were instead standing at barbed wire selling scraps to survive. Children who should have been shielded by innocence were instead broken by a violence they never asked for. I did not understand the full weight of it until I became a father years later. Holding my own child, watching her laugh freely, I thought of the girl in the village, her small hands stretched out, not for comfort, but for survival. It broke me all over again. The nights grew longer after that. Every sound carried meaning, every silence carried guilt. When I pulled the cord on the artillery piece, I no longer saw the shell arc away. I saw faces. Faces of people I had never met but had somehow condemned. The war had become personal not because I believed in its cause, but because I could no longer escape the knowledge of what it truly was. It was slaughter. It was cruelty. It was a machine grinding up human lives, both theirs and ours, and I was caught inside it. Even now, decades later, the weight of that realization presses against me. I carry no visible scars from those nights, but the invisible ones run deep. I was not shot. I was not maimed, but I was changed in ways that no discharge papers could release me from. When I close my eyes, I hear the thunder of artillery. When I dream, I see the children. And when I wake, I feel the shame of knowing that I once believed survival alone was enough. That is the question that never leaves me. What do you do with the knowledge that you were part of something so senseless, so devastating? You can try to bury it, try to drown it in silence, but it resurfaces. In every quiet night, in every look from your own child, in every reminder of what it means to be human, the war did not end when I left Vietnam. It carried itself back with me, stitched into my memory, echoing in my conscience. I learned then that the battlefield does not stay overseas. It follows you home, and it waits for you in the stillness, reminding you of what you did and what you could not undo. That is what it means to be haunted, not by the fear of dying, but by the knowledge of surviving in a way that leaves you forever changed. There are nights when I still wake to the sound of silence, and that silence is far louder than any explosion I ever heard in Vietnam. It is the silence just before the mortar falls, the silence when you are holding your breath, waiting to find out if you will live or die. That silence has stayed with me long after the war ended, long after I left the jungles and the fire bases behind. What makes it unbearable is not just the fear I felt for myself, but the realization that the same silence pressed down on villages full of people who had no weapons, no bunkers, no orders to follow, only the will to survive one more night under our shadow. That silence belongs to them as much as it belongs to me, and it binds us in a way I can never escape. I remember the first time I understood that war was not only about soldiers. It was not in the middle of a firefight, not during the long nights of guard duty, but in the face of a child. She stood on the edge of a village we weren't supposed to enter, selling small things, with hands that should have been drawing pictures or playing with friends. At the time, I thought little of it, just another strange detail in a strange land. But years later, when I watched my own children grow, the truth cut me open. She had been forced to barter away her childhood, and I had been part of the machine that left her no choice. That realization has never let me go. The Army told us we were there to win hearts and minds. They gave us cards with those words printed neatly, as if propaganda could become truth, but the orders contradicted the slogans. We fired artillery blindly into the night, harassment and interdiction they called it, as though giving it a name made it less monstrous. We were told not to talk to the villagers who approached the wire, not to see them as people, only as potential threats. Yet every time I looked into their eyes, I saw nothing of the enemy I had been promised. I saw only exhaustion, sorrow, and a dignity that somehow endured, even as everything else crumbled. The hypocrisy tore at me. How could we win hearts and minds if we weren't even allowed to acknowledge them as human? I defied those orders once, and I paid for it. A major arrived at our base barking commands, eager to assert control. He declared that no one was to speak with the Vietnamese who lingered near the wire. I looked at him and felt something snap inside me. I walked past him straight to the wire and began talking to a group of villagers. The punishment came swiftly, in Article 15, a reduction in rank. But I wrote my defense clinging to the only truth I knew, that the war was already lost if we had to silence compassion to fight it. Against all odds, I won that case, but victory brought no peace. It only deepened my conviction that the war itself was a lie, a cruel theater, where the cost was measured not just in bodies, but in souls. What haunted me most was the distance. I never saw the faces of those struck by our artillery, but I felt them. Each round we fired carried more than steel, and fire it carried guilt, a weight that pressed deeper with every passing day. I began to wonder If survival meant becoming numb, if the only way to endure was to bury humanity beneath obedience. But I couldn't bury it. The girl in the village, the old men watching us with weary eyes, the women clutching children at their sides, they would not let me forget. Their shadows followed me back to the fire base, into the bunkers, into the restless hours of night when I prayed for morning and feared what it would bring. There is something unspeakable about realizing you are the terror in someone else's story. For me, that was the true wound of Vietnam. I was not just a frightened young man clinging to life. I was part of the force that stole life from others, that turned childhood into survival, villages into targets, silence into fear. That is what I carried home, what I still carry now. Not the pride of service, not the brotherhood of arms, but the knowledge that my presence left scars on people who never had the chance to understand why we were there in the first place. Even after all these years, the memories return in fragments. The smell of wet earth after a night of shelling, the way my hands shook as I tried to light a cigarette in the dark, the sudden laughter of children who had nothing left but laughter to give. These fragments collide inside me, breaking me open again and again. I am left with contradictions. I cannot resolve the kindness of villagers who had every reason to hate me, the trust in the eyes of a child who should have turned away, the way compassion somehow survived, even where war tried to erase it. When I look back, I see not only what I endured, but what I became. And that is the heaviest burden of all. The war did not end when I left Vietnam. It followed me home, stitched into my conscience, replaying itself in quiet rooms and sleepless nights. The girl in the village still stands there barefoot and brave, and I still cannot answer the question in her eyes. Why? Why us? Why here? Why at all? That is the silence I live with. It is the silence that comes before the mortar, falls the silence that holds both my fear and hers, the silence that will never release me. And in that silence, I know there is no closure, no redemption, only the fragile hope that telling the truth might keep someone else from adding to its weight. There are moments burned so deep into memory that no passage of time can dull them, moments that rise without warning and leave you breathless, as if the air itself refuses to let you forget. For me, one of those moments came not during a firefight, not while shells screamed overhead, but in the stillness afterward, when the guns fell quiet, and I was left staring at what we had done. The ground was scarred, the trees shattered smoke curling upward into a sky that seemed indifferent to it all. Somewhere, beyond the haze, beyond the barbed wire, and the reach of our artillery, I imagined the lives we had just torn apart. I could not see them, but I felt them. And it was in that emptiness, that awful quiet, that I realized the war would never let me go. By then, the days and nights had already blurred into one long stretch of dread. Fear was constant, but what began to eat away at me was not just the fear of being killed, it was the fear of what I was becoming. Each time I pulled the cord that launched another shell into the night, I wondered if a child would wake screaming, if a mother would huddle closer to her baby, if a family would be forced to flee from what we called strategy. I had entered the war as a young man who believed in ideas, who clung to books and questions, but I felt those parts of me slipping further away with every fire mission. What replaced them was silence, numbness, a hollow space where conviction used to live. And yet, in the midst of that unraveling, there were glimpses of something that pierced through the haze. One of them came the day we set down our weapons and walked into a nearby village. It was a small act of defiance, a choice to meet the people not as enemies, but as human beings. I remember the villagers' faces wary at first, then stunned, as if they couldn't quite believe we had come without helmets, without rifles. There were women bent over fires, old men watching us with cautious eyes, and children whose curiosity outpaced their fear. For a few moments, the war receded. We were not soldiers and civilians. We were simply people standing together in a place that had known too much pain. But that moment of fragile humanity only made everything harder. Because once you have looked into the eyes of those you are told are your enemy, and seen only exhaustion and sorrow, you cannot return to the illusion that war is clean or noble. You cannot fire another round without imagining the faces on the other end. You cannot bury the knowledge that survival for you may mean suffering for them. It became impossible to separate my own fear from theirs, my own nights of waiting from the nights they endured under the same relentless sky. I began to feel the weight of what some call moral injury, though at the time I had no words for it. It was the ache of knowing that I had been complicit, that my presence had added to the suffering of people who never chose this war. It was not just guilt, it was something deeper, a fracture in the soul that left me questioning who I was and what I could ever become after. I carried that fracture with me every day, and it has followed me through the decades since. The war demanded that we harden ourselves, that we silence compassion in order to endure. But I could not silence it. The memories would not let me. The barefoot girl in the village, the weary faces of old men, the quiet resilience of women trying to hold their families together, they became part of me, shadows I could never step out from. And when I came home, those shadows came with me. I did not speak of them for years, afraid of what they revealed, ashamed of what I had been part of. But silence, I learned, is its own kind of wound. Looking back now, I understand that the war never truly ended for those of us who lived it. The guns went quiet, but inside, we carried echoes that refused to fade. Some tried to bury them, to drink them away, to wall them off with anger. I tried for a while too. But eventually I realized that the only way to live was to face them, to name them, to let the truth breathe, no matter how much it hurt. Telling these stories does not bring peace, but it keeps the memories from devouring me entirely. That is why I speak now, even when my voice trembles, even when the words catch in my throat. Because there are faces I cannot forget, silences I cannot escape, and truths that demand to be heard. I survived the war, but survival came with a cost. I am still paying. And perhaps by telling it, by laying bare the weight I carry, I can offer something more than just a confession. Perhaps I can offer a reminder that war does not end when soldiers come home, that its shadows stretch across generations, and that the only way forward is to refuse to forget. The echoes of Vietnam are not locked in the past. They linger in memory, in conscience, and in the stories that refuse to fade. From the fear of nights under fire to the haunting sight of children forced to survive in a war they never chose. This journey reminds us that history is not just written in textbooks. It is carried in the hearts of those who lived it. Elias Monroe's voice trembling between shame and hope is more than a personal confession. It is a reminder that war reshapes both victim and soldier, and that its shadows stretch far beyond the battlefield. History, when told through human eyes, has the power to stir something deeper in us. It does not simply recount dates and battles, it demands that we ask who we are, what choices we make, and how we carry the weight of the past into the present. If these stories move, you share your thoughts below. Do you believe history still has the power to guide us, to warn us, to change us? What lesson from this story struck you the most? Your reflections keep these conversations alive and remind us that memory belongs not only to those who lived through war, but to all of us. And this is only the beginning. The past is full of voices waiting to be heard, stories of survival, defiance, and unexpected humanity in the darkest of times. Stay with us as we continue uncovering them. Subscribe, follow, and join this journey through history. Because the more we listen, the more we discover that the past is never really past. It's a mirror, and it is speaking to us still.